Welcome back, family, to Black House Live's book lecture series. We are discussing Dr. Amos Wilson's Blueprint for Black Power. Today's lecture will cover Chapter 3, Social and Cultural Origins of Power. Before we get started, I just want to strongly recommend that if you have not already checked out our lectures on Chapter 1, What is Power, our lecture on Chapters 2, Power Bases, social organization and ethnic resources. I strongly recommend you checking out those lectures. And before we jump into Chapter 3, we made a connection between Dr. Chancellor Williams, The Destruction of Black Civilization, his last three chapters, chapters 13, 14, and 15, linking that to the Blueprint of Black Power, right? These first two chapters, right? Dr. Amos Wilson, it is my contention, Blueprint for Black Power picks up where Dr. Chancellor Williams leaves off in The Destruction of Black Civilization. Chancellor Williams is making an argument for organizing African people for action, right? And Dr. Amos Wilson is making an argument that the most effective ways for Black people, African people, wherever we find ourselves, to actualize power, right, is to collectively organize ourselves. And so I want to make those two connections. Today, we're going to jump right into Chapter 3, the social and cultural origins of power. According to Dr. Wilson, culture is the social instrument that is used by people that helps them adapt to the complex nature of the world around. Right? So a culture's ability and or inability to adapt to a variety of complex situations, according to Dr. Wilson, will dictate its ability to have a quality life, right? Or whether it have a long or short life. According to Dr. Wilson, culture is a power system. And as a holistic system, it is made up of a variety of subsystems. The family is one of those subsystems. So according to Wilson, the family is hierarchical in structure, meaning that different members of the family exercise different privileges, prerogatives, and different levels of authority, right? So Dr. Wilson wants us immediately to think of culture in a non-traditional way, right? When we tend to think about other cultures, there may or may not be expectations on its members. There may or may not be consequences on its members, right? And members may all share all of the same privileges. But Dr. Wilson is saying that culture as a power system operates quite differently from the traditional sense. Family is a system where power is exercised and its members are not connected by kinship, blood, and shared history. However, they are related in terms of membership rights, duties, behavioral expectations, and authority. So again, just like the culture as a power system, the family as a power system is different than the way in which we think about the traditional family, right? A family of power has structure. Members can be included or excluded. There are expectations and consequences in a family power system. A family power system influences particularly its young's attitudes and behaviors toward relationships of power and authority within and without the family. Dr. Wilson is going to talk to us later in this lecture. We're going to talk about the socialization process, what he refers to as identification. And in an identification stage, it is important to get the young to identify itself, right, with its culture, right? And if it's being socialized by an outside individual, then it's important to get that youth, that infant, to identify itself with that other. And so in this instance, Dr. Wilson is saying that the Black family has to socialize its young and get it to identify itself, right, with the power and with authority at a very early age. And so a culture is only as powerful as its families and vice versa. A family is only as powerful as its culture. According to Dr. Wilson, true political power organization begins with developing power relationships between family and kinship groups. As a history teacher, studying ancient civilizations, many of those civilizations developed as a byproduct of the well-organized families and clans aligning themselves together, around the collective resources that they shared, right, that they had at their disposal. And so Dr. Wilson is talking about voluntary alliances of families and clans who acknowledge the same leaders, working together in the same economic enterprises, right, and agreeing to conduct and maintain peace amongst themselves, working for our own economic interests, right, and agreeing to develop infrastructures of how we're going to protect and defend ourselves. Dr. Wilson reminds us that culture is represented symbolically and operationally through the use of our minds and our bodies, and that culture does not exist outside of the human, right? We are culture. Culture is what we make. Culture as socially manufactured. If culture is what we make it, then, right, we know culture is socially manufactured. It's a social construct. Some of the most important social products, according to Dr. Wilson, right, that are manufactured by a culture is cultural identities, social and personal identities of its constituent and individual members, right? In this chapter, in the next chapter, more specifically, we're going to be talking about the need and the development of a new African culture and African personality. This chapter, we're going to talk about the need of the development of a new African culture. According to Dr. Wilson, white supremacy has to be the number one issue of focus for African people, the number one problem to be solved. There's nothing else more important than ending white supremacy. Our conferences and rallies should be geared around answering the question, what kinds of culture must we construct in order to overthrow white supremacy? If our agendas are not about to overthrow white supremacy, then they're pointless. Culture, social, and personal identity. According to Dr. Wilson, the socialization process creates the social product, cultural identity. The socialization process then is a process that produces new responses, new values, new perspectives, new orientations, and new behaviors. Once an individual group has been socialized, according to Dr. Wilson, right, they produce new behaviors in order to meet the new reality that they've been socialized for. Dr. Wilson argues that Black culture has been socialized by white America for white American interests. And while we maintain some of our indigenous elements, we've been indoctrinated with white American values and interests that do not serve us, right? So currently, Black culture has been socialized by white America for white American interests. Socialization, according to Dr. Wilson, is the most efficient means of control. Much like Dr. Du Bois's argument of double consciousness, Wilson argues that Black culture has been doubly socialized. First, by white culture, and secondly, by its own indigenous Black culture. Dr. Wilson argues that the socialization process is facilitated by something he calls identification. Wilson argues that from birth, we learn to identify ourselves and behaviors with the dominant other. So this is why we're talking about why it's important for the Black family to socialize, right? It's young, early, in order to get our youth to identify, right, with our culture, with our values, with our economic and political, social, and cultural expectations. Identification. Dr. Wilson argues that identification is nothing more than the fitting of an individual group for a prescribed role. Our children have to understand at a very early age that they are going to serve particular roles, that they have a particular purpose within the culture, within the society. He reminds us that a person can be socialized to fit a role that serves the interests of the dominant group, but can also be socialized for a role that inadvertently counters the interests of the dominant group, if not socialized properly, right? Our children can be used against us, right? And for many of us who have been socialized within this dominant white racist culture, right, don't understand that despite that socialization, right, we are in unique positions to undermine, right, the current objectives of this white racist society. Dr. Wilson reminds us that our current identities as oppressed people is a socially manufactured identity made by white American culture. The current identity, this current identity as oppressed poor Black folk, is a socially manufactured identity that serves white interests. And if we want to do something about that, then we're going to have to do something about the current identities, this current socially manufactured identity that we possess. The identity of oppression is an instrument of social power and social control designed to serve the political and economic interests of white America. And so according to Dr. Wilson, there has to be a deculturation process by which we unidentify ourselves with the oppressed socially manufactured identity and reculturate ourselves with a new African identity. Dr. Wilson reminds us again that we must perceive white supremacy as the major social, political, economic, and spiritual problem to be resolved by African people, not by the Supreme Court, right? Not by nonprofit organizations, but solved by African people. We must ask ourselves, what kind of culture must we construct in order to overthrow white supremacy? No one else is going to do that work for us. According to Wilson, the answer must lie in the direction of the reclamation of our African identity and the reconstitution of our African-centered consciousness, supported by an African-centered cultural, social, political, and economic values, institutions, and relations. Until we reclaim our own identities, until we start to work within our own frameworks and see the world through our own eyes, we will continue to allow ourselves to be controlled, right, and dominated by other groups of people. The Black family is a power system. Dr. Amos Wilson reminded us in the previous lectures that white society has always recognized a threat in Black unity, right? And just like they recognize the threat of Black unity, the Black family poses an economic and political threat to the white status quo. The family is an alignment of persons usually related by blood or adoption with a shared history, shared identity, values, etc. The power that's generated by a family system can not only be utilized, right, to improve the quality of life for that particular family, but it can improve the quality of life for its community. And thus, there lies the threat, right? If Black families overall are able to actualize its power systems, develop these power networks, then it would not only improve the quality of life for individual Black families, we would see Black communities thriving across the nation and across the world. In order for that to happen, white power would change drastically. According to Dr. Wilson, the destruction of the Black family, we should see that connection, right, in that terminology and that labeling, to make that connection between Dr. Chancellor Williams and the destruction of the Black civilization. The destruction of the Black civilization was a political decision. Black civilization had to be destroyed in order for white civilization to rise, right? And so in the same way that the Black civilization was destroyed politically, that was a political decision, the destruction of the Black family was a political decision. Dominant groups must constrain, restrict, destabilize, and destroy the family systems of groups they wish to bring under their control. For African American people, this process began with our enslavement by white Europeans in order to control Black folks. You had to control their families. You had to control the family dynamic. You had to destroy it. So the Black family was exploited for its labor. White America capitalized on its human and material capital resources to produce the accumulation of capital surplus and social power. This is how white folks have obtained the power that they have. Dr. Wilson argues that as long as the Black family is dependent on white America and we remain without an independent African-centered consciousness that honors our cultural traditions and values, we will continue to identify with and reactionarily serve the economic interests of white America. Until we start to operate for our own interests, we will be the tools for someone else's. It's simple. Religious institutions and power. In the same way that the Black family had to be destroyed, right? Had to be socialized to work for the economic interests of white folks. so too did the religious institutions of Black folks have to be destroyed because it represented power. Black religious institutions at its best, right, are these powerful sources of organizing Black folk. And so those institutions have to be destroyed. According to Dr. Wilson, every culture has a moral, religious, ethical system, which he defines as its attitudes concerning right and wrong, feelings and conduct, its acknowledgement of a God, of divine, preeminent, cosmic, or universal principles, related symbols of belief, faith, and worship. Dr. Wilson reminds us that a people, religious system serves as an entity for organizing that people and is one of the most influential centers of its power, if not its most fundamental sources of power. And so in the dominant culture, recognizing Black religious institutions being one of its most influential sources of power, it had to destroy, right, this institution. According to Dr. Wilson, the Black church and its leaders are cultural icons. No other cultural leadership in the Black community has obtained the kind of cultural authority that the Black ministerial establishment has, right? At the time that this book was published in the 90s, most of the research of the book comes out of the 70s and the 80s, right? The Black church occupied a significant role, was a huge instrument in the Black community. Now it can be debated whether or not it still occupies that same role today, right? But at the time of the publishing of this book, it occupied that place. And Dr. Wilson is going to go on to talk about the Nation of Islam, right? And so at the publishing of this book, the NOI occupied a huge role. It played a huge role, right, in the Black community. Now, it can be debated whether or not the NOI still occupies that same social, cultural, and psychological role that it once played in community, right? But no one can debate the influence of the Black ministerial establishment, right? However, Dr. Wilson and many others predicted the eventual demise of the Black church as it lost its relevancy with the Black community. According to Wilson, the Black church has squandered its potential, impaired and prostituted its service of white Eurocentric culture. It's lost its ability to be able to resonate to the reality of the Black community. It's lost its message, right, of resonating to the realities of African people the world over. Dr. Wilson argues that the wasting of this power potential has been a result of Black preachers teaching a forced borrowed theology that undergirds the Black church perceptions, its expectations, its members, and its leadership. And so its theology that is not its own, that is not unique to its own people, cannot relate. It cannot connect to the hearts and minds, right, and the realities of its members and its constituents. Dr. Wilson argues that Black people do not relate to or serve God for the same reasons or in the same ways. If African people were praying to God for liberation and freedom from the slave master, and the slave master were praying to God for liberation and freedom, right? Who was God listening to? Who was God obligated to serve? Africans have to realize that Christianity has not served Black people in the same way that it has served white people. Wilson argues that whites serve to rationalize and justify white supremacy, that Christianity was created to justify white supremacy. Dr. Wilson argues that white Christian theology disempowers Black people because it induces a sense of moral inferiority while inducing a sense of superiority. We all are aware, right, of the white racist rationale and spiritual rationales that are provided, right, for Black people. Supposedly Black folks are the descendants of Ham. And because Ham looked on his father's nakedness, right, Ham was cursed. And because Ham was cursed and we are the descendants of Ham, that is somehow supposed to explain Black folks' position in the world today, African folks' position in the world today. And it was racist, theological, racist, spiritual rationales such as these that were provided to explain white supremacy. And Dr. Wilson argues, especially in the form of good versus evil, good versus bad precepts and behavior, He argues that the African's acceptance of white valuations and definitions of good versus evil, good and bad as objective, divinely inspired, universal, race neutral, allows us to be duped and dominated by whites through the proliferation of these ideas. As long as we continue to accept these white racist theological rationales and justifications, we continue to allow ourselves to be duped and dominated. Dr. Wilson argues that both white political ideologies and religious theologies serve to mentally manipulate and exploit Black people. Black preachers, as advocates of racially biased theologies and political ideology, become the unwitting allies and mercenary surrogates for the domination and exploitation of the African. When we uncritically accept and teach these white ideologies and teach from these white frameworks, we unwittingly become mercenary surrogates for the domination and exploitation of our own people. We end up doing the dirty work. We end up becoming the tools of white supremacy against our own people. According to Dr. Wilson, in addition to adopting misleading white racist tainted religious theology and ideology, the Black community has been socially poisoned with the political myth of individualism. Wilson goes on to say that the wholesale adoption by the Black community, by the Black church and non-church leadership of the mythologies of capitalism, the unrestrained individualism, the self-centered, self-serving, narcissistic, competitive self-promotion, the careerism, accepting these as the cultural foundations of African community, right, predisposes us for our disempowerment and our social development. We drink the Kool-Aid of individualism and believe that we as African people are going to achieve our goals as the result of each individual competing with each other. That's ridiculous. Dr. Chancellor Williams reminded us in chapters 13, 14, and 15 of The Destruction of Black Civilization. This was the same trick that was done on African people as African folks were fighting for their independence. They individually fought each other so that they could obtain their individual independence. And as a result, Europeans ended up still controlling all the resources. We too will remain controlled as individual pieces on the board, competing against one another for white European rations and crumbs, if we do not commit ourselves to collectively coalescing, right, our resources, organizing our talent and our expertise to destroy white supremacy at its roots. According to Dr. Wilson, individualism is a myth because America did not acquire its power from independent individual pursuits of advantages, even though it may appear it did so. America acquired its white power through white ethnocentrism, through white racism, through white social cooperation, mutual aid, socially shared values, through white attitudes and constraints and restrictions of other individuals' expressions of liberty, right? So while white folks are telling us to go at it alone and to compete against each other as individuals, they're organizing themselves together. They're organizing themselves in clubs and special interests as lobbyists. And we're going to talk about that when we get into chapters 8 and chapters 9, right? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Solutions to this individualism, the strengthening of intra-group ties and obligations, the development of collective identity. And in the Black community, this is not an anti-individualistic thing when we talk about developing the collective African identity. According to Dr. Wilson, the highest meaning of a social group is to foster the development of individual potential. The community's own well-being is improved, right, when the individual potential is improved. A group must empower itself as a whole if it is to empower its individual members, right? Dr. Wilson reminds us. And so according to Wilson, the myth of individualism serves the purpose of making the subject individual. Black people in this instance believe that since given their freedom to exercise their ambitions and talents to the fullest, the assumption of discrimination and white supremacist domination, right, are excuses that no longer hold weight. You Black folks you have your freedom. You're free to do whatever you want to. What do you mean racism? What do you mean white supremacy? The myth of individualism is supposed to destroy those quote unquote excuses. According to Dr. Wilson, Blacks have erroneously come to accept their lack of success and their powerlessness in white American society as a product of their own personal, social, cultural, and ethnic inadequacy, and not the result of what he refers to as a constraining opportunity structure. Where lies in society the same type of economic, political, social opportunities that exist for white folks, poor and otherwise? Our uncritical internalization of American individualism allow us to continue to be duped and dominated. In order to counteract the racist socialization for subordination, powerlessness, and poverty by the European American community, the Black community must oppose white power. We must organize ourselves, right, to defeat and end white supremacy. The Black community has to socialize its collective personality and character. Note that Dr. Wilson does not state socialize one's individual personality, but the collective personality of the Black community. Gotta be about this business. Can't be some of us talking about ending white supremacy, right? And then the rest of us over here, we're gonna do business with them. Our next lecture, chapter 6, is going to focus on power and personality. Dr. Wilson offers the Nation of Islam as a Black organizational example. The NOI as a religious cultural institution flows from its unique theological and ideological infrastructure. And so as we just got done talking about the Black church, right, and its failure of producing its own unique religious theology, ends up preaching this borrowed and forced theology. Dr. Wilson provides the Nation of Islam as an example because of its unique theological, ideological framework. Dr. Wilson states, like white Christianity, Black Islam is a religion and culture which serves a people, not a religion which the people serve. Excuse me. According to Dr. Wilson, the unique religio-historical, mytho-ideological system includes a feeling in its members of specialness or superiority, not of being bad or inferior, as does white Christianity. So again, the opposite of white Christianity here, the Nation of Islam, its religious, historical, its mythology induces in its people a feeling of superiority, of specialness, right? Wilson goes on to say that Black Muslims do not perceive themselves to be the footstools of other people, right? That the NOI did not rely on outside validation or authority or permission from Orthodox Islam or the Muslim countries of Dar Islam. The NOI didn't need to be rubber stamped by Orthodox Islam to say, hey, these Black Muslims can read the Quran and they can call themselves Muslims. According to Wilson, its Islam had been Africanized and is therefore uniquely its own creation and therefore instrumental in advancing the interests of the NOI and its members, not the interests of others. That's the supreme difference here. That this religious, historical, mytho-ideological infrastructure prepares the members of this particular faith to work for their own interests, not the interests of other people. Dr. Wilson argues that the NOI is an example of Black religious self-definition and self-determination. It empowers its members, it provides them with self-esteem and self-confidence. Other Black organizations can use the NOI as an example of self-definition and self-determination. What is special about the NOI, right, is that other Black organizations and institutions can't necessarily, and have not up until this point, motivated its members toward a sense of self-control, a control of environment, self-sufficiency, and independency in the same way that the NOI did. And this was one of the major differences that separated itself, right, in the 50s and in the 60s and the 70s, and even up until today, uh, a lot of its self-help programs and its rehabilitation programs in community are still second to none. Dr. Wilson reminds us that he's not proselytizing for the Nation of Islam. He's not a member of the NOI. Neither am I a member of the Nation of Islam, but is merely using it as an example of a Black-centered organization, right? And of the cultural, psychosocial organization whose founding ideology is Black or African-centered, right? In context and compared to those whose ideology is white or European-centered. If the Nation of Islam can develop its own unique African-centered or Black-centered ideology, so can other Black institutions and Black businesses. According to Dr. Wilson, the reason why the NOI is such an effective example of Black cultural self-determination is because its socioeconomic, its social cultural outcomes and influences and power potential can be utilized by other Black organizations. Specifically, right? Its African-centered identity is focused on African-centered identity and consciousness, African-centered ideological systems based on a thorough knowledge of and admiration of African self, a race-first educational and economic institution building, self-love, self-assertiveness, expressive creative intelligence, values, and behaviors. These are the ingredients and outcomes that other Black organizations and institutions can use, right, to organize the Black community, to organize African people the world over. Dr. Wilson argues that whatever the foundation or ideology, borrowed or synthesized, it must be adapted to fit the specific reality of the African wherever they find themselves situated in space and time. So this question around when Black people are organizing themselves, when Black folks are developing their own curriculums and their own frameworks, can we use non-Black or non-African sources? And according to Dr. Wilson, yes, we can, but they must be adapted. They must be Africanized, right, to fit the reality of African people. Because if not, that foundational ideology becomes the facilitator of the exploitation, the manipulation, and the domination of African people. If we do not end up adapting them to fit our reality, they can serve to be weapons against the very people that we're called to serve. Spirit of war. The NOI also serves as a positive example of self-determination, right, and self-definition because its name implies that it is a nation and that it is organized as such. And every nation, according to Dr. Wilson, right, has an organized trained military or paramilitary establishment for offensive and defensive purposes. Dr. Wilson argues that it should be noted that the nation and the white Christian church share in common an assertive warlike or martial tradition, a tradition of making war against their enemies or defending themselves against their enemies by force or arms. He goes on to argue that the tradition of jihad permeates the Nation of Islam as much as the warrior and warlike European tribal traditions and Christian soldierly traditions permeate the white Christian church. All right. The NOI serves as an example because it has maintained its commitment to martial strategic thinking and organizing. According to Dr. Wilson, the result of our spiritual socialization and identification with racist white ideologies and theologies, we've lost our warrior spirit. We being African people, the Black community. We've shown our African traditions and values that were rich of a warrior tradition, rich of a mentality and worldview. Wilson reminds us that unless we are called to fight in the Eurocentric wars and military, paramilitary forces, we don't even actualize that aspect of our cultural personality. Wilson goes on to say that the military and warrior traditions, the martial arts and military strategic thinking indigenous to African history and culture was lost to the African American community as a result of its deculturation and enslavement. The patriarchal organization, identification, and cooperation required and imbued by warfare has been lost to the Black community, along with the ability to utilize and apply military-like strategy and military-like organization to non-military arenas. This is one of the greatest losses, right, as a result of our enslavement, as a result of white imperialistic force and domination. We've lost a lot of our traditions. And we tend to talk a lot about the things we lost economically, or the things that we've lost culturally, but rarely, if ever, do we tend to talk about what we lost in terms of our martial strategies. Dr. Wilson argues that the African American community must recognize that if it cannot achieve its economic and social well-being by the usual legitimate means, then it must achieve them by unusual means. Dr. Wilson reminded us in chapters 1 and 2 that white folks didn't acquire the power that they got by legitimate sources. They robbed, they stole, they murdered, right? And they exploited folks. And this idea today that all other races of people, in order to obtain the same kind of power, are going to have to buy, purchase, and negotiate legitimately with white folks to acquire these resources, right? Or to acquire equal footing with these folks is a ridiculous notion. And so Dr. Wilson states that if Black folks are unable to acquire, right, their economic and social well-being legitimately, then we must achieve them in unusual means. And I will allow any listener under the sound of my voice to define what that means for themselves. In chapter 2, we discussed the need for African people to engage in civil disobedience in hopes of breaking our blind compliance to unjust laws and complying with systems that do not serve our economic and political agendas, right? When we stop allowing ourselves to be used, we can no longer be used. Dr. Wilson argues that to accomplish these necessary goals, the community must painstakingly examine the nature and functionality of its culture and cultural institutions. It must especially examine and revise its family and religious institutions, rebuild and build anew its economic and educational institutions. Of especially great importance, the African American community must train its boys and its women very carefully, intelligently, and intensely for manhood and womanhood. African American manhood and womanhood must be redefined in ways which positively redefine the relations of African men to women, their families and community. Above all, they must be taught the skills of manly and womanly intimacy, honor, cooperation, reliability, loyalty to community. They must reassume their roles as warriors, defenders of family and community, as assertive and skillful traders, strategic thinkers, and superb tacticians. The power of community is the power of its men and women. It cannot long survive half slave and half free. Dr. Wilson wanted to remind us of that. I want to thank everybody for listening to this lecture. I encourage you again to check out chapters 1, 2, also our lecture on the destruction of the Black civilization, chapters 13, 14, and 15, right? And our next lecture will focus on chapter 6 of the Blueprint of Black Power, Personality and Power. Thank you, family. Peace. Until next time.